The cruelest thing wealthy people do is assume intelligence should sound expensive. Ethan Calloway once heard his mother say, when he was 12 years old, but standing inside the Astoria Crown Ballroom on a snowy Manhattan night almost 20 years later, he had forgotten every lesson she ever tried to teach him. The ballroom glowed beneath golden chandeliers hanging like rivers of crystal above marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected the soft amber lighting across the room. Outside the towering windows overlooking Central Park, snow drifted slowly through the New York skyline, while black luxury cars lined the hotel entrance below. Inside, violin music blended softly with jazz piano while investors, politicians, celebrities, and billionaires moved through the ballroom carrying glasses of red wine and conversations worth millions of dollars. Near the center of it all stood Ethan Calloway, 38 years old. White tuxedo jacket tailored perfectly against broad shoulders. Dark hair touched lightly with silver near the temples. Founder of Calloway Global Ventures. Financial magazines called him visionary. Television interviews called him ruthless. Most people in Manhattan simply called him untouchable. Tonight, he hosted an international charity gala benefiting cultural preservation programs across Northern Europe. Every detail inside the Astoria crown had been designed for perfection. The flowers imported from Iceland. The wine flown in from Paris. The musicians carefully selected to impress foreign diplomats and investors seated near the ballroom stage. And moving quietly between all of them was Claire Bennett, 29 years old, blonde hair pinned softly behind her neck, pale skin warmed by the chandelier light, calm blue eyes lowered politely while carrying silver trays through the crowded ballroom in a fitted black waitress uniform. She moved with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to being invisible in expensive rooms. Claire preferred it that way. Invisible people noticed everything. Near the ballroom bar, Ethan reviewed event schedules with one of his executive assistants while guests continued arriving beneath the snowfall outside. Claire stepped carefully beside him carrying champagne flutes balanced against a silver tray. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. "Your guest from Reykjavik has arrived." Ethan looked up immediately. Then he laughed lightly beneath his breath. Not cruelly. Worse. Casually. "It is pronounced Reykjavik," he corrected while several nearby investors smiled politely. Claire's fingers tightened slightly beneath the tray, though her expression remained composed. "I apologize." Ethan shook his head with amused superiority. "You should probably learn the pronunciation before serving at international events." One woman near the bar laughed quietly into her wine glass. Another investor smiled awkwardly. Claire simply nodded once. "Of course, sir." Then she turned calmly and walked away through the ballroom without another word. Ethan barely thought about the moment afterward. Men like him corrected people constantly. Assistants, drivers, employees, hotel staff. It felt normal inside rooms built around power. But across the ballroom, Claire Bennett quietly exhaled while adjusting the silver bracelet hidden beneath the sleeve of her uniform. The old bracelet had belonged to her father. Reykjavik University, Department of Nordic Linguistics. She touched it briefly the way some people touched old scars. Near the ballroom entrance, several diplomats from Iceland and Norway arrived beneath the warm hotel lights, while photographers captured images against a marble backdrop covered in white roses and gold lettering. Ethan moved toward them confidently, shaking hands and exchanging practice conversations while servers carried trays of champagne between guests. Everything appeared perfectly controlled, until one of the older Icelandic diplomats suddenly frowned while speaking with the event translator beside the ballroom stage. He switched languages abruptly. Fast. Formal Icelandic layered with older ceremonial phrasing difficult even for fluent speakers to follow comfortably. The translator froze almost immediately. "I apologize," the young man stammered nervously. "Could you repeat that more slowly?" The diplomat repeated himself again, this time sounding visibly irritated. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ethan noticed the tension immediately. "What is happening?" one executive whispered beside him. The translator looked increasingly panicked now, while the Icelandic diplomat continued speaking sharply in his native language. Nobody nearby understood enough to help. Then from near the ballroom wine station, a calm female voice answered softly in perfect Icelandic. The entire ballroom seemed to pause at once. Claire stood quietly beside a silver tray beneath the chandelier light, while speaking with effortless fluency. Not rehearsed, not academic, natural, elegant. The older diplomat stopped speaking instantly. His expression changed from irritation to visible surprise. Claire continued calmly, explaining a misunderstanding involving ceremonial acknowledgments attached to the cultural foundation being honored that evening. Her pronunciation carried soft, traditional cadence rarely heard outside Iceland itself. Ethan stared across the ballroom in complete disbelief. Claire was not simply speaking the language correctly. She sounded emotionally connected to it. The older diplomat suddenly smiled warmly and answered her again in even faster Icelandic. Claire responded immediately. Several Nordic guests nearby slowly lowered their wine glasses while listening. The ballroom became impossibly quiet beneath the soft piano music still drifting from the stage. Ethan felt something strange move through his chest then. Recognition, not of Claire, of the language itself. Because buried beneath her soft Icelandic pronunciation was something he had not heard in nearly 20 years. His mother's voice. The same rhythms. The same soft northern inflections she used while singing old Icelandic lullabies beside the fireplace during Manhattan winters when he was a child. Ethan stood completely motionless while Claire translated calmly for the diplomat beside the ballroom stage. Snow reflected silver light through the windows behind her while crystal chandeliers glowed above the room in complete silence. Then Claire spoke one final phrase softly in Icelandic. A traditional greeting rarely spoken outside older families from Reykjavik. Ethan's breathing stopped for half a second, because his mother used to whisper the exact same words before kissing his forehead goodnight. Ethan Calloway stood completely still beneath the chandelier light after hearing Claire Bennett speak the final Icelandic phrase. The ballroom around him blurred into soft gold reflections and distant jazz music while snow drifted silently beyond the towering Manhattan windows. For one impossible moment, he was no longer 38 years old standing inside the Astoria Crown Hotel, surrounded by billionaires and diplomats. He was 12 again, sitting beside the fireplace in his mother's penthouse apartment while she wrapped a wool blanket around his shoulders and whispered old Icelandic lullabies into the winter darkness outside. The memory hit him so suddenly it almost hurt. Claire remained near the ballroom stage beside the elderly Icelandic diplomat, calmly explaining details about the cultural foundation attached to the evening's charity event. Her pronunciation carried the same soft northern rhythm Ethan remembered from childhood. Not modern textbook Icelandic. Older, warmer, the kind spoken inside homes rather than classrooms. Guests throughout the ballroom had gone unusually quiet now. Wealthy investors who laughed earlier at Claire's accent suddenly watched her with visible confusion. One executive whispered softly beside Ethan, "Where did the waitress learn to speak like that?" Ethan did not answer because he could barely think clearly himself. The older diplomat smiled warmly toward Claire before responding in Icelandic again. Claire listened carefully, then laughed softly beneath her breath before translating into English for the nearby guests. He says New York usually destroys beautiful pronunciation. Several people laughed politely. Ethan did not, because the sentence sounded exactly like something his mother would have said. Claire gently adjusted the silver tray balanced against her arm while the diplomat continued speaking with her. Calm, elegant, completely comfortable inside a language almost nobody else in the ballroom recognized. Ethan noticed something unsettling then. Earlier tonight, when Claire apologized after he corrected her pronunciation, she had not sounded embarrassed, only patient, like someone accustomed to powerful people making assumptions before listening carefully. One of the charity board members approached Ethan quietly. "You never mentioned hiring multilingual staff." Ethan finally looked away from Claire long enough to answer. "I did not know." The board member gave a low whistle beneath his breath. "That woman speaks Icelandic better than the interpreter." Across the ballroom, the young translator who froze earlier now stood near the stage looking deeply uncomfortable while Claire effortlessly continued translating ceremonial details for the Nordic delegation. Several Icelandic guests had gathered around her already, smiling warmly as she spoke. Ethan noticed how naturally they trusted her. Not because of status, because language recognized sincerity faster than wealth ever could. Claire finished speaking with the diplomat and carefully stepped away from the stage carrying fresh wine glasses toward the ballroom bar. Ethan moved toward her almost instinctively before realizing he was doing it. She noticed him approaching immediately, but kept her expression calm. "Sir," she said politely. Ethan stopped beside the marble counter while soft piano music echoed through the ballroom behind them. For a moment, he forgot every prepared social skill he usually relied on in rooms like this. "Where did you learn Icelandic?" Claire placed 2 champagne flutes carefully onto a serving tray before answering. "Reykjavik." Ethan stared at her. "You lived there?" "For several years." Her voice remained soft and controlled. Ethan noticed the silver bracelet partially hidden beneath the sleeve of her uniform now. Old, worn smooth with time. Nordic lettering engraved faintly across the metal. "Your family moved there?" Claire nodded once. "My father researched Nordic languages." Ethan looked at her more carefully now. "At the university?" Claire seemed slightly surprised he knew enough to ask. "Yes." Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly because his mother spent years supporting Icelandic cultural programs connected to Reykjavik University before she died. The memories returned quietly now. Icelandic books stacked beside fireplaces. Soft northern folk songs playing through the apartment during snowstorms. His mother correcting his pronunciation gently while laughing at his frustration. Ethan had not thought about those winters in years. Success had buried them beneath meetings, acquisitions, and endless Manhattan ambition. Claire reached for another tray beside the counter. "Excuse me, I should get these to table 12. Ethan spoke before she could leave. "Earlier," Claire paused. Ethan looked briefly embarrassed for perhaps the first time all evening. "I should not have mocked your pronunciation." Claire studied him quietly for a second before answering. Most people hear accents before they hear intelligence. The sentence landed harder than Ethan expected, because he realized instantly she was right. He glanced toward the ballroom where executives and investors still watched Claire with cautious fascination now that they understood she possessed something intellectually valuable. Earlier, nobody noticed her carrying champagne through the room. The only thing that changed was the language they respected. Ethan leaned lightly against the marble counter while snow reflected silver light across the ballroom windows behind them. "My mother used to speak Icelandic." Claire's expression softened slightly. "I know." Ethan blinked once. "You know?" Claire nodded gently. "The older dialect you understood when the diplomat greeted you." She hesitated briefly. Very few Americans recognize those phrases unless someone taught them young. Ethan stared at her in silence. She noticed that too. "Your mother must have spoken beautifully," Claire added softly. The sentence almost unraveled him emotionally because nobody had spoken about his mother that way in years. Most people remembered her as a socialite, philanthropist, or wealthy widow. Claire somehow spoke about her like a person instead of a headline. Ethan looked down briefly at the polished marble floor before asking quietly, "How did you know the greeting?" Claire's fingers brushed lightly against the silver bracelet beneath her sleeve. "An elderly woman in Reykjavik used to say it every winter before serving tea." Her voice lowered slightly. "She reminded me of home." The ballroom music softened further while guests continued moving through rivers of golden chandelier light around them. Ethan noticed something almost painful then. Claire never once tried to impress anyone tonight. She simply spoke honestly in a language connected to memory instead of status. And somehow that made the entire room feel smaller around her. One of Ethan's executives suddenly approached looking tense. "Mr. Calloway, the Nordic investors want to discuss revised contract details privately." Ethan nodded distractedly before the executive added carefully. "Apparently, they requested the waitress attend the conversation as well." Claire lowered her eyes immediately. "That is unnecessary." But the executive shook his head quickly. "Actually, they specifically insisted." Ethan looked toward Claire again while snow continued falling beyond the Manhattan skyline. Earlier that evening, people laughed softly when she spoke. Now international investors refused to continue negotiations without her in the room. Claire Bennett followed Ethan Calloway and the Nordic delegation through the quieter upper corridors of the Astoria Crown Hotel, while snow drifted against the towering Manhattan windows beside them. Below, the ballroom still glowed beneath golden chandeliers and soft jazz music, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier in the evening, Claire moved through the gala unnoticed, carrying silver trays and champagne glasses. Now international investors paused conversations when she passed. Hotel staff whispered quietly behind her. Executives who once ignored her now looked uncertain, standing near her. Ethan noticed every bit of it. And strangely, It unsettled him more than the financial negotiations themselves. The private conference suite overlooking Central Park smelled faintly of cedarwood and espresso beneath warm amber lighting. Long glass windows framed the snow-covered city outside while Icelandic diplomats and financial advisors gathered around a polished walnut table covered with translated cultural investment documents. Claire hesitated near the doorway instinctively. The black waitress uniform suddenly felt more visible inside rooms designed for people with power. Ethan noticed her discomfort immediately. "Please," he said softly while pulling out a chair beside the table. "Sit." Several executives exchanged quick glances. Claire did not move at first. "I am only here to translate if needed." One older Icelandic diplomat smiled warmly toward her. "You are here because you understand our language properly." The sentence shifted the room into silence for a second. Ethan watched Claire lower her eyes slightly, almost embarrassed by respect itself. She finally sat carefully near the edge of the table while executives reopened investment files and ceremonial partnership contracts. Snow reflected silver light across the glass walls surrounding the conference suite. Ethan took the seat directly across from Claire without fully realizing why. Perhaps because hearing Icelandic spoken in her voice still unsettled him emotionally in ways he could not explain. One of the Nordic advisors began speaking rapidly in Icelandic while referencing several pages inside the partnership documents. Claire listened quietly, then translated into English with calm precision. "He says the preservation funding percentages attached to the Reykjavik Restoration Initiative are lower than previously discussed." Ethan frowned immediately. "Lower by how much?" Claire glanced briefly toward the Icelandic advisor before answering. "Almost 12%. One executive nearly choked on his coffee. "That is impossible." Claire looked down at the contract wording carefully. No, her voice remained soft. "The language allows the percentages to decrease after external management restructuring." Ethan leaned forward slowly. "Restructuring controlled by who?" Claire translated the question fluently before the Icelandic advisor answered with visible irritation. Claire's expression changed subtly after hearing the response. Ethan noticed it instantly now. "What?" he asked quietly. Claire hesitated briefly. "A secondary investment group based in Luxembourg." Silence spread slowly around the conference table. One legal advisor immediately reached for the documents while Ethan's expression hardened. "That group was never mentioned during negotiations." Claire translated calmly again while the Icelandic diplomats exchanged frustrated responses. One older man finally slammed his hand lightly against the table in visible disappointment. Claire listened carefully before speaking softly in English. "He says they assumed Callaway Global already understood the structure." Ethan gave a humorless laugh beneath his breath. "Apparently not." Claire glanced toward him quietly, but said nothing. The room continued reviewing contracts while she translated page after page of Icelandic financial terminology with effortless precision. No hesitation, no performance, just calm understanding. Ethan could not stop watching her now. Earlier that evening, he corrected her pronunciation publicly because he assumed her accent meant limitation. Now his executives waited for her translations before making million-dollar decisions. The irony settled heavily inside him. During a brief pause in the negotiations, one of the diplomats studied Claire thoughtfully before asking something softly in Icelandic. Claire's expression softened unexpectedly after hearing it. Ethan noticed immediately. "What did he ask?" Claire looked almost reluctant to answer. "He asked if my father was Thomas Bennett." The room grew quiet again. One diplomat smiled warmly. "Your father lectured in Reykjavik years ago." Ethan looked toward Claire in surprise. "Your father taught there?" Claire nodded gently. "Nordic linguistic history." Another diplomat added something quietly in Icelandic while smiling faintly. Claire lowered her eyes before translating. "He says my father once spent 3 hours debating whether emotional memory changes pronunciation." Ethan stared at her. Emotional memory. Suddenly the phrase explained everything he felt listening to her voice earlier. Claire did not merely know Icelandic academically. She carried emotional connection inside the language itself. One executive leaned back slowly in disbelief. How does someone go from Reykjavik academic conferences to serving drinks at Manhattan galas? The room became awkwardly silent. Ethan immediately regretted the question on the executive's behalf. Claire remained calm, though. "Life changes," she answered softly. No bitterness. No explanation. just quiet finality. Ethan noticed the old sadness hidden beneath the sentence immediately. Before anyone could continue, one of the Icelandic advisors suddenly began speaking much faster now, while pointing sharply toward a section buried deep inside the investment appendix. Claire listened carefully. Then her expression changed. Ethan felt tension tighten inside the room instantly. "Claire," he asked quietly. She looked up slowly from the contract pages. "There is another issue." One executive sighed heavily. "Of course there is." Claire ignored the comment while tracing one paragraph lightly with her finger. "This section transfers partial cultural ownership rights after 5 years." Ethan frowned. "Meaning?" Claire looked directly at him now. Calm blue eyes beneath the warm conference lighting. "Meaning the Icelandic preservation sites could eventually become controlled by private international investors instead of the Cultural Foundation." Silence. One attorney whispered softly beneath his breath. "That was never disclosed publicly." Claire translated the clause again into Icelandic for the diplomats. Their reactions darkened immediately. Ethan watched the entire atmosphere inside the conference suite shift from negotiation into distrust. And sitting quietly in the middle of it all was the waitress he mocked less than an hour earlier because of an accent he assumed sounded small. Outside the windows, snow continued falling across Manhattan, while amber light reflected softly against the glass around them. Ethan looked at Claire carefully then. The calm intelligence, the restraint, the dignity. He suddenly realized something deeply uncomfortable about himself. Claire Bennett never changed throughout the evening. The only thing that changed was the value wealthy people assigned to her voice once they recognized something useful inside it. The private conference suite overlooking snowy Manhattan grew heavier with silence after Claire Bennett revealed the hidden ownership clause buried inside the Icelandic preservation agreements. Warm amber lighting reflected softly against the glass walls while executives reread the contract pages with visible disbelief. Beyond the windows, snow-covered Central Park beneath silver midnight light, while traffic moved slowly through Manhattan streets far below. Inside the Astoria Crown Hotel, however, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Earlier that evening, the gala revolved around prestige, luxury, and social performance. Now, every conversation inside the conference room centered around the quiet waitress sitting calmly beside the investment documents. Ethan Calloway leaned back slowly in his chair while staring at the translated clauses spread across the walnut table. They intended to privatize cultural sites after public funding stabilized them, he said quietly. Claire nodded once, gradually enough that most people would not notice until ownership structures became permanent. One attorney shook his head in disbelief. That would have created international outrage. Claire looked toward him softly. Only after the contracts became irreversible. The room fell quiet again. One of the Icelandic diplomats spoke sharply beneath his breath while closing the document folder in frustration. Claire translated calmly. He says they wrapped financial exploitation inside cultural preservation language because it sounds morally untouchable. Ethan almost laughed at the accuracy of it. Expensive people always preferred manipulation disguised as sophistication. And tonight, the only person willing to say it clearly wore a black waitress uniform instead of a custom tuxedo. Claire carefully adjusted the silver bracelet beneath her sleeve while reviewing another page of Icelandic translations. Ethan noticed the movement now. Small, habitual, like touching a memory instead of jewelry. One of the older diplomats suddenly looked toward her thoughtfully. Your father used to wear the same bracelet during lectures in Reykjavik. Claire froze slightly. Ethan noticed it immediately. You knew him personally? The diplomat asked gently in Icelandic. Claire nodded once. When I was little. The diplomat smiled sadly. Thomas Bennett could make language sound alive. Ethan watched Claire lower her eyes toward the contracts again. Every time someone mentioned her father, the calm around her shifted slightly. Not weakness. Grief carefully controlled over many years. Ethan understood that kind of silence more than most people realized. His own mother's death had turned parts of him emotionally cold long before business success finished the job. One of Ethan's senior executives suddenly entered the conference suite carrying updated financial reports. Mr. Calloway, there is another issue. Ethan looked up immediately. What now? The executive glanced briefly toward Claire before continuing carefully. Several members of the Luxembourg holding group arrived downstairs unexpectedly. The room became completely still. One Icelandic advisor muttered something sharply beneath his breath. Claire listened carefully before translating. He says they were never supposed to attend tonight personally. Ethan's expression hardened immediately. Meaning? Claire answered quietly. Meaning the situation may be larger than the cultural agreements alone. One attorney immediately reopened the investment files. You think they planned this intentionally from the beginning? Claire looked down at the translated clauses. I think people rarely hide ownership structures unless they are protecting something. Silence spread slowly across the room again. Ethan noticed how naturally everyone waited for Claire's interpretation now. Not because of status, because she understood what powerful people sounded like when they believed nobody important was listening carefully. One of the Icelandic diplomats suddenly spoke rapidly again while pointing toward a signature page attached to the investment contracts. Claire's expression changed almost invisibly after reading the translated name beneath the ownership group. Ethan noticed instantly. What is it? Claire hesitated. The secondary holding company director. Ethan frowned. Who? Claire slowly looked up from the document. Magnus Eriksson. The room reacted immediately. One executive swore softly beneath his breath. Another attorney straightened upright in visible alarm. Ethan frowned in confusion. I should know that name. One legal advisor answered quietly. Magnus Eriksson spent years acquiring historical properties through layered international investment structures. Claire added softly. Many Nordic universities stopped working with him after several ownership disputes. Ethan looked toward the contracts again. And he is attached to this partnership? Claire nodded once. Indirectly. One diplomat spoke sharply in Icelandic again. Claire translated carefully. He says Magnus Eriksson never appears publicly unless ownership transfer is already close to completion. Ethan stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the snow-covered windows overlooking Manhattan. The city lights blurred softly beneath the storm outside, while tension tightened inside the conference suite behind him. Earlier tonight, he worried about gala speeches and investor impressions. Now he realized he nearly signed away cultural preservation rights to a network of international investors hiding behind diplomatic language and charity branding. And the only reason he discovered it was because a waitress understood Icelandic. Ethan turned back toward Claire quietly. How did you catch this so quickly? Claire looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention. My father believed dangerous people usually sound polite first. One of the diplomats laughed softly beneath his breath. That sounds exactly like Thomas Bennett. Claire gave the faintest smile. Ethan noticed something then that unsettled him emotionally in a different way. Claire never sounded proud while revealing intelligence. Only careful, like someone taught knowledge was responsibility rather than performance. A soft knock interrupted the room before one of the hotel staff entered nervously. Mr. Calloway, he said carefully, the Luxembourg investors are requesting a private meeting downstairs. Ethan's expression remained cold. Tell them negotiations are paused. The employee hesitated awkwardly. They specifically asked whether the Icelandic translator would be attending as well. Silence. Claire lowered her eyes immediately while several executives exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan noticed her fingers tighten slightly against the edge of the table. You are not their translator, he said quietly. Claire looked toward him. Ethan's voice softened slightly. You are the only person in this building who realized what they were hiding. The sentence lingered heavily through the conference suite. Outside the windows, snow continued drifting across Manhattan while warm light reflected softly against the glass around them. Claire glanced down briefly at the silver bracelet beneath her sleeve before speaking almost quietly enough to disappear beneath the sound of the storm outside. My father used to say wealthy people become uncomfortable when someone without status understands too much. Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly he looked around the conference room filled with executives, attorneys, diplomats, and investors now, depending completely on the waitress he publicly corrected less than 2 hours earlier. And for the first time all evening, Ethan Calloway realized the uncomfortable truth was not that Claire Bennett understood too much. It was that everyone else in the room had spent years mistaking wealth for intelligence because they never learned how to recognize dignity when it arrived wearing ordinary clothes. The atmosphere inside the Astoria Crown Conference Suite changed completely after the Luxembourg investors requested Claire Bennett personally attend the private negotiation downstairs. Warm amber lighting reflected across the polished walnut table, while snow drifted endlessly beyond the towering Manhattan windows overlooking Central Park. Executives sat in tense silence, surrounded by translated contracts, untouched espresso cups, and scattered financial reports. Earlier that evening, the gala ballroom downstairs echoed with effortless luxury and polished conversations. Now, every powerful person inside the hotel understood something dangerous had been hiding beneath the elegance from the beginning. Ethan Callaway stood near the glass windows with both hands resting against the edge of the conference table while studying the city lights below. Why would they specifically ask for Claire? One attorney finally asked quietly. Claire remained seated near the far side of the table, calm blue eyes lowered toward the Icelandic documents spread carefully before her. Because they know someone understood them, she answered softly. One executive frowned immediately. You think they realize you overheard something? Claire hesitated briefly before nodding once. Possibly. Silence settled heavily through the room again. Ethan looked toward her slowly. Earlier tonight in the ballroom, he paused carefully. Did you hear something besides the contract discussions? Claire's fingers brushed lightly against the silver bracelet beneath her sleeve. A habit Ethan recognized now whenever she considered how much truth to reveal. Finally, she answered quietly. Near the balcony before the gala speeches began, two Luxembourg representatives were speaking Icelandic with one of the Nordic advisors. One attorney leaned forward instantly, and Claire lifted her eyes calmly. They believed nobody nearby understood them. Ethan already disliked where the conversation was going. What did they say? The snowfall outside seemed louder somehow against the windows while the conference room waited silently for her answer. Claire spoke carefully. They discussed delaying public ownership disclosures until after the cultural restoration funding stabilized property values. One executive swore softly beneath his breath. Another attorney closed his eyes in visible frustration. Ethan's expression hardened immediately, meaning they intended to profit privately from historical preservation sites. Claire nodded once. Yes. One diplomat added something sharply in Icelandic while staring toward the contracts. Claire translated quietly. He says Magnus Eriksson has used similar structures before. Ethan walked slowly back toward the table while tension tightened visibly across the room. And nobody caught this before tonight. One attorney answered bitterly. Because nobody thought to question the language translations closely enough. Silence followed again. Ethan glanced briefly toward Claire, then away, almost immediately. The irony no longer felt subtle. A waitress carrying champagne through a ballroom had uncovered what teams of corporate attorneys and international executives completely missed. One of the Icelandic diplomats suddenly looked toward Claire thoughtfully before speaking softly in Icelandic. Claire listened, then smiled faintly for the first time in several minutes. Ethan noticed instantly. What did he say? Claire lowered her eyes slightly. He said my father used to warn people that dangerous contracts often sound beautiful when translated badly. The older diplomat nodded slowly. Thomas Bennett hated elegant dishonesty. Ethan almost smiled despite the tension. Somehow he already understood exactly what kind of man Claire's father must have been. Brilliant. Difficult. Emotionally honest in rooms filled with performance. Perhaps that explained Claire herself. She never once tried to impress anyone tonight. She simply refused to pretend false things sounded harmless. A soft knock interrupted the room before one of Ethan's senior assistants stepped inside nervously. Mr. Callaway, the Luxembourg representatives are waiting downstairs in the private wine lounge. Ethan looked toward him coldly. Tell them negotiations remain suspended. The assistant hesitated awkwardly. They insisted the issue could be resolved quickly in person. Claire quietly looked up from the contracts then. That means they are worried. The room shifted toward her immediately. Ethan frowned slightly. How can you tell? Claire answered softly. People who feel powerful prefer delays. People who feel exposed ask for immediate meetings. The sentence landed heavily around the table because everyone understood she was probably right. One executive muttered beneath his breath. I cannot believe the smartest person in this building works banquet service. Claire looked down immediately after hearing it. Not offended. Only tired. Ethan noticed the reaction instantly. He realized then that compliments based entirely on surprise still carried disrespect hidden inside them. The executive essentially admitted he never expected intelligence to exist beneath a waitress uniform. Ethan suddenly remembered his own correction earlier that evening near the ballroom bar. The careless smile. The public embarrassment. Claire had not changed since then. Only the room's willingness to hear her had changed. One of the Icelandic advisors suddenly reopened a translated appendix attached to the investment documents. He spoke quickly in Icelandic while tracing several highlighted paragraphs with visible urgency. Claire leaned forward carefully while reading the clauses. Her calm expression slowly disappeared. Ethan felt tension rise immediately. Claire, she looked up slowly. There is another problem. One attorney almost laughed bitterly. Of course there is. Claire ignored the comment while turning the translated pages toward Ethan. The Luxembourg group planned to restructure voting authority after 12 months. Ethan scanned the language carefully. So, Claire's voice remained soft. After restructuring, Callaway Global would lose operational control over the preservation board entirely. Silence. Absolute silence. Ethan stared down at the contracts while snow reflected silver light across the glass walls around them. 1 year. They planned to use his public reputation, his company funding, and his international influence to stabilize the cultural projects before quietly removing his authority afterward. And they nearly succeeded because everyone in the room focused more on status than understanding. Ethan slowly looked toward Claire again. The quiet waitress in a black uniform sitting beneath warm conference lighting while billion-dollar negotiations depended completely on her ability to hear what powerful men assumed ordinary people could never understand. Claire noticed him watching her. Your mother spoke Icelandic fluently, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. She believed language revealed character. Claire's expression softened almost invisibly. She was right. Outside the Astoria Crown Hotel, Manhattan disappeared deeper beneath falling snow, while luxury traffic moved silently through the glowing city streets below. Inside the conference suite, executives, diplomats, and attorneys sat motionless around the table, while the waitress Ethan, once corrected publicly, became the only person powerful enough to protect them from people who hid greed behind beautiful words. The private conference suite inside the Astoria Crown Hotel remained silent long after Claire Bennett revealed the hidden restructuring clause that would eventually strip Ethan Callaway of operational control over the Icelandic Preservation Board. Snow continued falling beyond the massive windows overlooking Manhattan, while soft amber light reflected against the polished walnut table covered in contracts, legal notes, and half-finished espresso cups. Earlier that evening, the gala downstairs celebrated culture, prestige, and philanthropy. Now everyone in the room understood they had nearly become part of an elegant financial trap hidden beneath diplomatic language and luxury branding. Ethan stood near the windows watching snow drift across Central Park while executives whispered quietly behind him. For years he believed control came from wealth, leverage, and reputation. Tonight control belonged entirely to the quiet waitress who understood Icelandic better than the men negotiating billion-dollar agreements. Claire remained seated near the edge of the conference table, fingers resting lightly against the silver bracelet beneath her sleeve while rereading several translated clauses. Calm, focused, almost detached from the tension surrounding her. One of Ethan's attorneys finally broke the silence. We need to terminate the negotiations immediately. An Icelandic advisor shook his head carefully. Claire translated softly. He says ending the deal publicly tonight could trigger international backlash against the cultural foundation itself. Ethan turned from the windows slowly. Then what do you suggest? The advisor answered in Icelandic while glancing toward Claire. She listened carefully before translating. Expose the hidden clauses before the Luxembourg group controls the narrative. One executive sighed heavily, meaning a public confrontation. Claire looked down briefly before speaking quietly. No. The room shifted toward her immediately. People like Magnus Eriksson survive public confrontation, she explained softly. They prepare for outrage. Ethan frowned slightly. Then what hurts them? Claire lifted her eyes calmly. Precise truth. Silence settled again because somehow the answer sounded more dangerous than anger. Ethan studied her carefully. You have seen this before. Claire hesitated for several seconds while snowfall brushed softly against the windows behind Ethan. Finally, she answered. My father once exposed a similar ownership structure attached to academic research funding in Reykjavik. One diplomat nodded slowly beneath his breath. That scandal destroyed several investors. Claire's expression remained distant now. It also destroyed my father's career. Ethan felt something tighten quietly inside his chest. He understood then why Claire moved through powerful rooms with such caution. Intelligence had cost her family everything once already. One attorney leaned forward carefully. What exactly happened to him? Claire's fingers tightened slightly against the silver bracelet. He refused to sign translation approvals, hiding foreign ownership transfers. She paused briefly. Afterwards, several financial groups accused him of professional misconduct. Ethan watched the room absorb the sentence quietly. Wealthy people rarely attacked intelligence directly. They attacked credibility instead. One executive looked genuinely disturbed now. Your father was punished for telling the truth. Claire lowered her eyes. He was punished for embarrassing influential people publicly. The sentence lingered heavily inside the conference suite, while snow reflected pale, silver light across the glass around them. Ethan suddenly remembered something his mother once told him during a winter dinner years ago. Powerful people forgive mistakes faster than humiliation. He had not understood it then. Tonight he finally did. A soft knock interrupted the silence before one of Ethan's assistants entered nervously. Mr. Calloway, the Luxembourg representatives are becoming impatient downstairs. Ethan's expression hardened immediately. Good. The assistant hesitated awkwardly. One of them specifically requested to speak with Miss Bennet privately. Every person in the room became still. Claire slowly looked up from the contracts. Ethan answered before she could speak. That will not happen. The assistant nodded quickly and left. One Icelandic diplomat muttered something sharply beneath his breath. Claire translated softly. He says they are trying to determine how much she understands. Ethan looked toward Claire carefully now. How much do you understand? Claire almost smiled faintly at the question. Enough. The simplicity of the answer somehow unsettled the entire room more than a long explanation would have. Ethan walked slowly back toward the conference table while studying the translated ownership structures again. If we expose the clauses publicly, they deny intent. Claire nodded once. Yes. If we terminate the deal quietly, they preserve their reputation. Yes. Ethan frowned. Then what is left? Claire looked toward the snowy Manhattan skyline beyond the windows before answering softly. Make them explain the clauses themselves. One attorney blinked in confusion. What? Claire carefully slid one translated document across the table toward Ethan. Invite the Luxembourg representatives upstairs. Silence. Ethan stared at her. You want them here? Claire nodded gently. People hiding behind elegant language become uncomfortable when forced to define their own words precisely. One Icelandic advisor slowly smiled beneath his breath. Your father taught interrogation through grammar. Claire's expression softened almost invisibly. He believed truth usually collapses under clarification. Ethan suddenly realized what she was suggesting. If the Luxembourg investors explained the clauses publicly before attorneys, diplomats, and financial advisors, their manipulation would expose itself naturally through contradiction and avoidance. Not emotional accusation. Intellectual pressure. Ethan looked at Claire differently then. Not simply impressed anymore. Respectful. Deeply respectful. Because she understood something most wealthy people never learned. Intelligence did not need volume to dominate a room. One executive quietly shook his head in disbelief. You should be sitting on a negotiation board somewhere in Geneva, not carrying champagne through Manhattan ballrooms. Claire looked down immediately after hearing it. Tiredness crossed her face briefly. People become uncomfortable when waitresses sound educated, she said softly. Ethan answered before anyone else could. No. Claire looked toward him quietly. Ethan's voice remained calm beneath the warm conference lighting. People become uncomfortable when they realize how often they ignored intelligence standing directly in front of them. The room fell completely silent after that. Snow drifted endlessly beyond the windows while the city lights blurred silver against the storm outside. Claire held his gaze for several long seconds without speaking. Then slowly she looked away toward the old translated contracts scattered across the walnut table. Ethan understood something painful then. Earlier that evening he corrected her accent because he assumed sophistication belonged naturally to people like him. But now sitting inside a conference suite filled with executives, diplomats, and attorneys depending entirely on her understanding, Ethan Calloway finally realized the most humiliating thing about arrogance was not how loudly it spoke. It was how confidently it listened too little. The conference suite overlooking snowy Manhattan became almost unnaturally quiet after Claire Bennett suggested bringing the Luxembourg investors upstairs and forcing them to explain the hidden clauses publicly themselves. Warm amber lighting reflected across crystal water glasses and translated contracts, while the city shimmered silver beyond the towering windows. Ethan Calloway stood beside the walnut conference table, watching Claire carefully now. Earlier in the evening, he saw a waitress with a soft accent carrying champagne through a luxury ballroom. Now every executive, attorney, and diplomat inside the Astoria Crown Hotel waited for her judgment before speaking. One of Ethan's legal advisors finally broke the silence. If we confront them directly, they will deny intent. Claire nodded gently. Yes. And if they realize we understand the Icelandic clauses? Claire looked toward the contracts quietly. Then they will try to redefine the language. One diplomat smiled faintly beneath his breath. Exactly like Magnus Eriksson always does. Ethan frowned slightly. You have dealt with him personally? The diplomat answered coldly in Icelandic while Claire translated. Once. He paused briefly. That was enough. Snow drifted harder against the windows now while tension thickened inside the conference suite. Ethan slowly looked toward Claire again. You are certain this works? Claire hesitated before answering softly. People hiding dishonesty behind sophisticated language usually panic when forced to explain simple meanings publicly. The sentence lingered heavily around the table because everyone understood she was not speaking only about contracts anymore. She was speaking about power itself. A soft knock interrupted the room before Ethan's assistant stepped inside carefully. Mr. Calloway, the Luxembourg delegation is waiting in the executive wine lounge downstairs. Ethan nodded once. Bring them here. The assistant hesitated briefly. All of them. Ethan's expression remained calm now. Controlled. Every single one. The assistant disappeared quickly. Claire lowered her eyes toward the contracts again while the conference room settled into tense preparation. One attorney quietly rearranged legal documents. Another reopened translation appendices beside the Icelandic diplomats. Ethan remained standing near the windows, studying Claire carefully, while soft piano music from the ballroom drifted faintly upward through the hotel floors below. You are very calm, he said softly. Claire almost smiled. No, Ethan looked surprised. Claire's fingers brushed lightly against the silver bracelet beneath her sleeve again. I am practiced. The honesty of the answer unsettled him more than confidence would have. She spoke like someone who spent years surviving rooms where powerful people underestimated her until they became threatened by what she understood. One of the diplomats suddenly spoke gently in Icelandic while looking toward Claire. She listened quietly before translating into English for the room. He says your father once corrected Magnus Eriksson publicly during an academic finance conference in Oslo. Ethan noticed Claire's expression tighten slightly. What happened? He asked carefully. Claire remained silent for several seconds before answering softly. My father exposed several hidden ownership structures connected to Nordic research funding. One attorney frowned immediately. The same type of manipulation happening tonight. Claire nodded once. Yes. The diplomat added another sentence quietly. Claire lowered her eyes before translating. Magnus Eriksson never forgave the humiliation. Silence settled again around the conference table. Ethan suddenly understood something painful then. Claire was not simply helping him avoid financial manipulation tonight. She was facing the same type of people who quietly destroyed her father years earlier. And somehow she still remained calm enough to protect strangers sitting in a luxury hotel conference room. The elevator doors outside the suite opened softly several moments later. Footsteps echoed through the hallway. Expensive shoes against marble flooring. Confident. Controlled. Then 3 men entered the conference suite wearing dark tailored suits beneath the warm hotel lighting. Magnus Eriksson walked at the center. Tall. Silver-haired. White. His expression remained perfectly composed despite the tension waiting for him inside the room. Ethan immediately understood why people found him dangerous. Magnus carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to entering rooms already believing he belonged above everyone else inside them. His eyes moved across the conference table calmly before settling briefly on Claire. For half a second his expression changed almost invisibly. Recognition. Then it disappeared. Mr. Calloway, Magnus said smoothly while extending his hand. Ethan ignored it completely. Please sit. The atmosphere inside the room tightened instantly. Magnus slowly lowered his hand before taking a seat opposite Ethan. The other Luxembourg representatives followed quietly beside him. Snow reflected silver light across the glass walls surrounding the suite, while attorneys organized translated contracts near the diplomats. Claire remained seated near the far side of the table beside the Icelandic documents. Calm blue eyes lowered toward the pages before her. Magnus glanced toward her again. Interesting choice for a translator, he said lightly. Several executives stiffened immediately. Ethan noticed Claire remained completely still. Magnus continued with a faint smile. Although perhaps tonight everyone is pretending not to notice appearances. The sentence settled awkwardly inside the room. Ethan felt immediate irritation rise inside his chest because he recognized the tone instantly. Elegant disrespect disguised as sophistication. Claire finally lifted her eyes slowly toward Magnus. Language becomes dangerous when people assume only certain kinds of people understand it. Silence. Absolute silence. Magnus studied her carefully now for the first time all evening. Not dismissively anymore. Carefully. Ethan noticed the change immediately. One of the Icelandic diplomats quietly slid the translated ownership clauses across the table toward Magnus. Perhaps, Ethan said calmly, you could explain these sections personally. Magnus glanced toward the highlighted clauses without reacting visibly. Then slowly he smiled. Of course. But Claire noticed something nobody else did. His fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the paper. Just for a second. The smallest movement imaginable. Yet enough. Because people comfortable with truth rarely become tense when asked to explain their own words clearly. Claire lowered her eyes toward the contracts again, while snowfall continued drifting endlessly across Manhattan outside. Somewhere deep beneath the polished confidence filling the conference suite, she realized Magnus Eriksson understood something dangerous now. The waitress he dismissed the moment he entered the room was not simply translating language tonight. She was dismantling the protection powerful men built around themselves when they believed ordinary people could never hear them clearly. The conference suite inside the Astoria Crown Hotel became so quiet that the sound of snow brushing against the windows seemed louder than the conversations inside the room. Magnus Eriksson sat calmly beneath the warm amber lighting with the translated contracts spread before him while executives, attorneys, diplomats, and financial advisors watched in complete silence. Ethan Calloway remained standing near the head of the walnut table, one hand resting lightly against the polished surface, while Claire Bennett sat several feet away beside the Icelandic documents. Earlier that evening, she carried champagne through crowded ballrooms, while wealthy guests ignored her existence. Now billion-dollar negotiations revolved entirely around what she understood. Magnus adjusted the silver cuff beneath his tailored sleeve before finally speaking. The ownership clauses are standard protective measures attached to international cultural funding structures. His voice sounded smooth, elegant, controlled. Exactly the kind of voice Claire's father used to warn her about. The kind designed to make dangerous things sound harmless. One attorney immediately frowned. Protective for who? Magnus smiled faintly. For the long-term preservation of the properties. Claire quietly turned one translated page toward him. Then why does the clause transfer voting authority after 12 months? Silence touched the room instantly. Magnus glanced toward her slowly. Because operational efficiency requires stable governance. Claire nodded gently. Stable for whom? Ethan noticed something important then. Claire never raised her voice. Never interrupted aggressively. She simply continued asking questions until dishonesty became difficult to organize elegantly. One Icelandic diplomat watched her with visible admiration now. Magnus folded his hands calmly together. Miss Bennett, he said smoothly. Complex international structures are not always easy to interpret without legal context. Several executives shifted uncomfortably after hearing the subtle condescension inside the sentence. Claire remained calm. Then perhaps you could explain why the ownership transfer is hidden inside a secondary appendix written partially in Icelandic legal terminology. The room fell silent again. Magnus' expression changed almost invisibly. Ethan noticed immediately now. Tiny movements. Slight pauses. The smallest tightening near the eyes whenever Claire forced him toward precision instead of performance. One of Ethan's attorneys slowly leaned back in his chair while reviewing the highlighted clauses again. Actually, he said carefully, she is correct. Magnus turned toward him smoothly. The appendix references standard Nordic preservation governance. Claire answered before the attorney could speak again. No. Her voice remained soft beneath the warm conference lighting. It references private authority reassignment after valuation stabilization. Silence. Absolute silence. Snow continued drifting beyond the towering Manhattan windows, while every person inside the room slowly realized the conversation was no longer moving in Magnus Eriksson's direction. Ethan watched Magnus carefully now. For the first time since entering the conference suite, the older investor no longer looked fully comfortable. Claire quietly slid another translated page across the table. Would you also explain this section? Magnus glanced downward briefly. Then his expression hardened almost imperceptibly. That language concerns property management contingencies. Claire looked toward him calmly. Including liquidation rights? One attorney nearly dropped his pen. Another executive whispered softly beneath his breath. Ethan stared down at the translated clause while tension moved visibly through the room. Liquidation? He asked coldly. Claire nodded once. If the preservation sites failed projected revenue targets after restructuring, ownership groups could dissolve portions of the cultural trust. One diplomat muttered something sharply in Icelandic. Claire translated quietly. He says they plan to turn historical preservation sites into luxury investment properties. Ethan slowly looked back toward Magnus. The room no longer felt elegant now. It felt exposed. Magnus remained composed for several long seconds before finally answering. Those clauses were precautionary. Claire's blue eyes lifted toward him calmly. Then why were they hidden? Silence again. This time heavier. Longer. Because there was no graceful answer left. Ethan realized what Claire understood from the beginning. Powerful people often depended less on lies than on complexity. If contracts sounded sophisticated enough, most rooms became too intimidated to ask clear questions. But Claire was not intimidated. She translated sophistication back into plain truth until manipulation became visible to everyone. One executive quietly shook his head in disbelief while staring toward Claire. You just dismantled an international acquisition structure wearing a waitress uniform. Claire lowered her eyes immediately after hearing it. Ethan noticed the reaction. Again, the same exhaustion. Because even compliments still carried surprise that intelligence could exist inside someone ordinary. Magnus suddenly looked directly toward Claire for the first time all evening without condescension. Only recognition. You are Thomas Bennett's daughter. The room became still instantly. Claire remained silent for several seconds before answering softly. Yes. Magnus leaned back slowly in his chair. Your father embarrassed very powerful people years ago. Claire's expression remained calm. My father translated contracts accurately. Magnus gave a faint, humorless smile. And paid dearly for it. Ethan felt the room tighten again. Not with fear. With shame. Because suddenly everyone understood Claire was not simply protecting Ethan's company tonight. She was standing inside the same type of room that once destroyed her father for refusing to ignore hidden exploitation disguised as diplomacy. Ethan spoke quietly then. And despite that, she still chose honesty. Magnus looked toward Ethan carefully. Honesty becomes expensive around wealthy people. Claire answered softly before Ethan could respond. So does silence. The sentence settled over the conference suite like snowfall settling across Manhattan outside. No one spoke for several moments afterward. The Icelandic diplomats looked toward Claire with deep respect now. Attorneys quietly reorganized contracts, already preparing to terminate the agreements. Magnus himself no longer argued. Because Claire Bennett had done something more dangerous than accusing him publicly. She forced him to explain himself clearly. Ethan slowly moved toward the head of the conference table while the city lights reflected silver against the windows behind him. Then calmly, in front of every executive, attorney, and investor inside the room, he looked toward Claire and said the words that should have been spoken hours earlier. I judged her before I listened to her. Silence followed immediately. Deep, honest silence. Claire looked toward him quietly while snow continued drifting through the Manhattan night beyond the glass. Ethan's voice softened slightly. And tonight she protected every person in this room from people who assumed intelligence only exists when it arrives wearing wealth. No one disagreed. Because the waitress Ethan mocked for her accent had quietly become the most respected person inside the Astoria Crown Hotel without ever raising her voice once. The conference suite inside the Astoria Crown Hotel remained silent long after Ethan Callaway admitted publicly that he judged Claire Bennett before listening to her. Snow continued drifting across Manhattan beyond the towering glass windows, while warm chandelier light reflected softly against the polished walnut table covered in contracts no one intended to sign anymore. Magnus Eriksson sat quietly now beside his legal advisors, the confidence that filled the room when he first entered slowly dissolving beneath precise translations and exposed clauses. Around him, attorneys reorganized financial documents while Nordic diplomats spoke quietly among themselves in Icelandic. But the emotional center of the room no longer revolved around billion-dollar agreements or ownership structures. It revolved around the quiet waitress standing near the windows holding a silver bracelet beneath the sleeve of her black uniform. Claire looked toward the snowy skyline outside, while soft jazz music drifted faintly upward from the ballroom floors below. The city lights blurred silver through the storm, covering Manhattan in the same pale winter glow Ethan remembered from childhood. For several long moments nobody spoke. Then Magnus finally stood slowly from his chair. "Mr. Callaway," he said carefully, "it appears our negotiations should conclude here." Ethan remained calm. "Yes." Magnus glanced briefly toward Claire again. Not dismissively this time. Almost cautiously. "Your father would find tonight familiar." Claire's fingers tightened slightly against the silver bracelet. "My father believed people eventually reveal themselves through language." Magnus gave a faint, humorless smile. "Your father believed many dangerous things." Claire met his gaze quietly. "Only to people hiding behind beautiful words." Silence settled across the conference suite once more. Magnus studied her for several seconds before nodding once and leaving the room with his delegation. No arguments. No dramatic exits. Just quiet retreat beneath the weight of truth finally spoken clearly enough that sophistication could no longer disguise it. The conference doors closed softly behind them. One of Ethan's attorneys exhaled heavily into the silence. "That woman just prevented one of the most expensive international acquisition disasters I have ever seen." Several executives nodded quietly in agreement. Claire lowered her eyes immediately after hearing it. Ethan noticed again how uncomfortable praise seemed to make her. Not because she lacked confidence. Because attention itself still felt unfamiliar after years of being overlooked. One Icelandic diplomat approached her warmly before speaking softly in Icelandic. Claire listened carefully, then smiled faintly. Ethan watched the change in her expression immediately. Softer now. Lighter somehow. "What did he say?" Ethan asked quietly after the diplomat stepped away. Claire looked toward the snowy windows before answering. "He said my father once told him intelligent people spend most of their lives being underestimated by rooms that mistake confidence for wisdom." Ethan almost laughed softly beneath his breath. "Your father sounds impossible." Claire's smile deepened slightly for the first time all evening. He was. The warmth inside the moment settled gently through the room, while executives quietly packed away documents and legal teams prepared revised statements for the morning. Outside the conference suite, the gala downstairs had nearly ended. The music softened. Guests departed through marble hotel corridors beneath golden chandeliers, while snow continued covering Manhattan in silence. Ethan slowly walked toward Claire near the windows overlooking Central Park. She stood alone now beneath the reflection of falling snow against the glass. The old silver bracelet remained partly hidden beneath her sleeve, while her calm blue eyes followed the movement of traffic below. "You saved me tonight," Ethan said softly. Claire shook her head gently. "I translated contracts." Ethan looked toward her carefully. "No," his voice lowered slightly. "You protected people who never even realized they needed protection." Claire remained silent. Ethan understood, then, that she had probably spent years hearing wealthy people praise intelligence only after it became useful to them. He did not want this moment to sound like that. "When my mother died," he said quietly, "I stopped speaking Icelandic completely." Claire glanced toward him slowly. Ethan continued, while watching snowfall drift beyond the city skyline. "It reminded me too much of her." Silence settled softly between them. Then Claire spoke almost quietly enough to disappear beneath the distant jazz music from downstairs. "Languages hold grief differently. Ethan looked at her carefully. What does that mean? Claire's fingers brushed the silver bracelet again. Some words carry memory even after the people connected to them are gone. Ethan felt something tighten unexpectedly inside his chest because it was exactly what happened earlier that evening when he heard her speak. Not simply recognition. Emotional memory returning through sound itself. Claire looked back toward the city lights outside. Your mother spoke beautifully. Ethan smiled faintly beneath the reflection of snowfall against the windows. You sound exactly like her sometimes. Claire became very still after hearing the sentence. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Then she must have been a remarkable woman, she answered softly. Ethan stared out across Manhattan for several long seconds afterward while the conference suite slowly emptied behind them. Attorneys left quietly. Diplomats shook hands near the doors. Hotel staff lowered the lighting slightly as midnight approached. Yet somehow the silence beside Claire felt more important than everything else that happened that evening. Ethan finally looked toward her again. What happens now? Claire gave the faintest smile beneath the warm amber light. Tomorrow morning, I probably serve coffee at 7 o'clock. Ethan laughed softly despite himself. After tonight? Claire shrugged lightly. I was the same person yesterday. The sentence settled deeply inside him because it carried the one truth he could no longer escape. Claire Bennett never transformed during the evening. She did not suddenly become intelligent when she spoke Icelandic. She did not suddenly become worthy when executives needed her translations. The only thing that changed was the room finally learning how to recognize dignity once it arrived wrapped in knowledge wealthy people respected. Ethan reached into the pocket of his tuxedo jacket and carefully removed a small silver business card. He handed it toward her quietly. If you ever decide you are tired of being invisible in rooms like this. Claire looked down at the card but did not immediately take it. Ethan's voice softened. Call me. Snow continued falling endlessly beyond the Manhattan skyline, while the last chandelier lights dimmed softly across the Astoria Crown Hotel. Claire finally accepted the card between her fingers before looking back toward the city outside. Somewhere beneath the silence, the jazz music, the snowfall, and the fading echoes of wealthy conversations, Ethan Calloway understood something his mother tried teaching him long before success made him arrogant enough to forget it. Intelligence does not become valuable the moment powerful people recognize it. It was always valuable. The tragedy is how many extraordinary people spend their lives waiting for the world to listen carefully enough to hear them clearly.